on our approaches, and really importantly, to solicit public feedback on our approach and make sure that we're keeping all of our coastal communities involved. I also want to note that today we have our Sea Grant Fellow with our biodiversity team here, Elise Goen. So Elise, if you can wave, we're really grateful to have her support here. She'll be adding some helpful links to the chat. And we are also very honored to have Maria Brown here. She's the Superintendent of Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries. And she's here with us today because we are going to be talking about strengthening biodiversity protections in national marine sanctuaries and aligning our state and federal 30 by 30 efforts, which we're really excited about. So hopefully many of you were able to join us back in November of last year for our first meeting, where we really kind of laid out our approach to conservation of coastal waters as described in the Pathways to 30 by 30 document, and heard a lot from members of the public about how their opinions and how they'd like to be involved in this effort moving forward. So we also had a really great meeting last month that I think many of you joined, where we talked about conservation beyond marine protected areas, right? So the role of all these existing spatial management measures that aren't MPAs in state waters and how they might support our goal to conserve 30% of coastal waters by 2030. And for those who missed those discussions, Elise will drop the links to recordings in the chat. So today we're meeting to drill down into another of our core approaches to 30 by 30 in coastal waters. Like I mentioned, strengthening biodiversity protections in California's national marine sanctuaries through state and federal partnerships. Let me go ahead and advance the slides here.
And
so,
Mike,
yeah,
I think Jen has joined us.
Awesome. Okay, then I will turn it over to Jen. Hey, Jen.
Unless she needs a moment. I think she needs just a moment so we can continue
Okay.
and she can jump in.
I'll keep going and then please cut me off and tell me to shut up when she's ready to rock and roll. So we'll start just by providing a quick overview of our approach to 30 by 30 in coastal waters. And then we'll turn it over to Maria to talk a little bit more about Greater Farallones Sanctuary and the management update plan process that they're going through there. And then we'll kind of open the floor for a roundtable discussion to receive input from all of you on this component of our 30 by 30 effort. So we've kind of prepared some guiding questions to help frame up the discussion, but really do want, honest, candid conversation around this part of 30 by 30. And then we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about next steps and how everybody can continue to be involved. So just a few ground rules for today's discussion. Same as always, if you've been to these webinars before, to speak, please raise your hand on Zoom and you'll be called on. If you're on the phone, you can raise your virtual hand by dialing *9. And put yourself on mute, please, when you're not talking. If you've called in by phone, to mute and unmute yourself, you can dial *6. So please be respectful. Respectful dialogue is a must. No personal attacks, obviously, no offensive language or anything like that. Please just make space for others. Give everybody an opportunity to share their perspective. We're excited to have a diversity of folks on the webinar with us today, and we want to hear from everybody. And let's keep our comments concise since we do have a lot of folks here. I think maybe almost 100. Please keep your comments to about 2 minutes. So just to introduce OPC and our role, so we are a cabinet level state policy body that's nested within the California Natural Resources Agency. And really our mission is to protect California's coast and ocean. We have a strategic plan, 2020 to 2025 strategic plan, and our work really encompasses in that strategic plan 4 major goal areas. So climate change, equity, biodiversity, and the blue economy. And we work really, really closely with our sister agencies, both state and federal, to advance those strategic priorities related to coastal and ocean protection. Now, backing up just a little bit to talk about the history of 30 by 30. So as many of you know, in 2020, Governor Newsom issued an executive order on biodiversity and climate. And part of that executive order committed to conserving 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030. And this was really part of a broader effort to fight climate change, to protect biodiversity, and importantly, to expand access to nature for all Californians. And so in 2022, The Resources Agency released this document here, Pathways to 30 by 30, Accelerating Conservation of California's Nature. In this document, if you haven't had a chance to read through it, I really encourage that you do so. It's pretty exciting. It's kind of the first roadmap. You know, a lot of folks are talking about 30 by 30. This is a real explicit roadmap of how we're going to get there. And it's a very bottom-up, grassroots approach, I think you'll find. So OPC helped author the coastal and ocean sections of this document, and we're serving as the lead for implementation in coastal waters. I'll just pause and see if Jen is here and ready to take over. If not, no problem.
I just got here.
Okay, there she is. Awesome.
Nothing like the last minute computer shutdown, which is just part of our life, I think, these days. I apologize for being late. And so, Mike, can you just let me know, are we just on this slide here?
Yeah, so we just wrapped up talking about pathways, and now we're going to talk about the definition of conservation.
Okay. I'm still trying to pull up stuff on the back end here, but I can just speak to the fact that our Pathways to 30 by 30 document includes a definition for conserved, and that is lands and coastal waters that are durably protected and managed to sustain functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and the diversity of life that they support. And so, yes, okay, next slide. So there are two components to this definition. Areas must be durably protected, and they must provide ecosystem level benefits to count for 30 by 30. So what does it mean to be durably protected? These are areas that have been designated through formal rulemaking or other regulatory process or similar process that has public input and review, and that would require a similar rulemaking or a process or decision point to change or eliminate that designation. The second element of the definition relates to conservation outcomes. In order to be considered conserved, an area must provide benefits at the ecosystem level. In other words, regulations must protect the structure and function of entire ecosystems. And then this means also that the areas are subject to ongoing monitoring and management to ensure conservation objectives are met. Next slide, please. So as detailed in the Pathways document, conserving 30% of coastal waters by 2030 will require action across these 4 strategies. The first is adaptively managing the state's MPA network to ensure that they continue to provide strong protections for coastal and marine biodiversity, especially in the face of climate change. So I will note that the first decadal management review of our MPA network was just released earlier this year, which covers, our MPAs cover 16% of state waters and are already considered conserved per the definition of conservation in the Pathways document. It's important to note that any changes to our marine protected area network or the management program that will come out of the decadal management review is going to happen through adaptive management process with the Fish and Game Commission and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Our second strategy is centered around working with federal partners to strengthen biodiversity protections in California's National Marine Sanctuaries, and that's why we're here today with Maria to talk more and do a deep dive there. The third strategy is partnering with California Native American tribes to establish indigenous marine stewardship areas that are focused on supporting and enhancing tribal stewardship of coastal and marine ecosystems. And the fourth strategy is our work in collaboration with scientists, fishermen, and others to explore the role of other effective area-based conservation measures, or OACMs. And these are areas that are geographically defined, that are not formal MPAs, but still may be providing effective conservation benefits in protecting biodiversity. Potential examples may include water quality protection, like the areas of special biological significance designated by the Water Board, or spatial fisheries management measures. Next slide, please. So today we're going to dive into our sanctuaries piece. And I think as many of us know on this call, California is home to 4 national marine sanctuaries, 3 of which cover close to 41% of the state's coastal waters. We've got the Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries, the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. These sanctuaries were established to conserve unique natural and cultural resources, and they include areas of exceptionally high biodiversity. And while these sanctuaries are durably protected and provide important conservation benefits for marine life and habitats, each sanctuary has different regulations and policies that we're working to assess to determine whether they fully meet the definition of conserved. The federal government is also committed to the 30 by 30 goal at the national level through the America the Beautiful initiative. State and federal conservation goals offer a unique opportunity to assess the top threats to biodiversity within sanctuaries, such as land-based pollution, ship strikes to whales, and kelp loss, and for state and federal managers to work together to address these threats. So I'll now turn it over to Maria Brown, Superintendent of Greater Farallones and the Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries, to talk a bit more about the process that she's undertaking to update the management plan for Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, and how we're all working together to align this important work with the state's 30 by 30 effort.
And Maria, just give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up your slides here.
Great. Well, as you're pulling up the slides, I'd just like to say thank you so much for inviting me to share with you how NOAA conserves biodiversity in national marine sanctuaries and the opportunity to work with OPC on helping to achieve the state's 30 by 30 goals. I'm looking forward to our conversation today and thinking about how we can work more closely together. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. I thought I'd start this presentation with the purpose of the National Marine Sanctuary so we can orient ourselves a little bit more on what the Act mandates us to do. So the Act basically outlines 9 purposes for National Marine Sanctuaries. 1, the first one, to designate significant marine areas. 2, comprehensive and coordinated conservation and management. 3, maintain and protect the natural biological communities. 4, enhance public awareness and appreciation. 5, support, promote, and coordinate scientific research and long-term monitoring. 6, to facilitate to the extent compatible with the primary objective of resource protection, use of sanctuaries not prohibited by other authorities. 7, develop and implement coordinated plans for protection and management. 8, to create models of and incentive for ways to conserve and manage sanctuaries. And 9, to cooperate with global programs encouraging conservation of marine resources. So that's an overview of what sanctuaries are supposed to do. If we can go to the next slide. I thought, let's see, I'd go over just where they are really briefly. The Office of National Marine Sanctuaries serves as a trustee for a network of underwater parks encompassing more than 6,260,000 square miles of marine and Great Lake waters, ranging from Washington State to the Florida Keys and from Lake Huron to American Samoa. And the network includes a system of 15 national marine sanctuaries and Papahanaumokuakea and Rose Atoll National Marine Monuments. The next slide. If we zoom in, we can see where I'm going to talk about, and that's the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. And it extends along the north central California coast. It actually overlaps with our management area, overlaps with the north central marine region for the state of California. The Greater Farallones Sanctuary itself extends from Manchester Beach in Mendocino County to offshore Half Moon Bay in San Mateo County. And this area was designated as a nationally significant area for marine biodiversity and conservation. Go to the next slide. And it is through science-based solutions and community engagement that the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary conserves the biologically diverse and globally significant ocean environment off North Central California. Next slide. So what makes this a globally significant area? It is upwelling. The Greater Farallones upwelling cell, which originates off Point Arena, is one of the most productive upwelling cells in the world. The winds off Point Arena push ocean water offshore, and cold, deep, nutrient-rich water replaces that near-shore surface water. And the circulation of nutrients provides the foundation for a rich and thriving ecosystem that ranges from plankton to apex predators. Now, go to the next slide. So this explosion of life that happens, you can think of it as on land as, you know, all the insects, or first the plants just explode when there's lots of nutrients and there's lots of sun. Same thing happens in the sanctuary. When there's the nutrients that come up from upwelling, the sun that shines during the spring, summer, and fall, the plankton blooms, and we get lots of plankton life, which feeds zooplankton. So the phytoplankton feed the zooplankton. And next slide, the zooplankton then feed our marine mammals, such as our humpback whales. This area is a destination feeding ground for whales that come from the tropics, from off Costa Rica, from Hawaii. They come, Mexico, they come here to feed. Next slide. It also feeds one of the largest concentrations of seabirds in the contiguous United States. So the plankton feeds the whales and the fish, and then the fish feed the seabirds. Next slide. And these fish then feed pinniped populations. So we have 6 different pinniped populations, including elephant seals, harbor seals, stellar sea lions, California sea lions, northern fur seals, and even Guadalupe fur seals that come to this region to feed. Next slide. And these seals and sea lions feed our white shark, one of our iconic species of the Greater Farallones. We have one of the largest concentration of adult and subadult white shark populations in the world, and they come here to feed. Next slide. So in addition to these species that live either part-time or full-time in the sanctuary, we also have species that migrate from all around the Pacific Basin. We have leatherback sea turtles that come to eat the jellies in the fall, and they're coming from Indonesia. We have shearwaters, a seabird. Some of them come from New Zealand up here to feed in the fall, and you will see thousands of them off our coast. We also have seabirds from Chile that come to feed. Next slide. And this explosion of life is not only the seabirds and marine mammals, it's also on the benthic habitat. And we have very rich deep sea coral habitat offshore here. Next slide. The nutrients feed all different habitats, including those deep sea ones, to subtitles such as kelp forests. Next slide. We have eelgrass beds that are very productive and feed, and not feed, but support a huge diversity of species. Next slide. And then we also have subtidal and intertidal areas that are very diverse as well. Next slide. And the sanctuary includes our shorelines, and it includes estuaries, lagoons, and beaches, sandy beaches. Next slide. Okay, so well, how do sanctuaries help meet the 30 by 30 conservation areas for the state? Well, sanctuaries are durable, as you heard Jen say, and I will go more into that. They're durable. They're managed to sustain functional ecosystems. So I'm going to do an overview of our regulations, our voluntary actions, some of our management actions we do, as well as how we engage communities, and conclude with the sanctuary's public process to increase biodiversity, in hopes that we can then have a robust discussion on how we can coordinate federal efforts with state efforts to make sure we're conserving the biodiversity of this really significant region in California. So I'm going to go on, if you hit next slide, to our regulations. One of the things that the National Marine Sanctuaries Act offers to all sanctuaries is that a prohibition on exploring for, developing, or producing oil, gas, or minerals. This is part of the Act. Next slide. And then sanctuaries can develop regulations specific to the sanctuary. And in the Greater Farallones, we have regulations on the construction and alteration of submerged lands. So it's prohibited to alter or construct on these submerged lands. However, there are some exceptions. There's exceptions for anchoring in a manner that is not otherwise prohibited. There's an exception for conducting lawful fishing activities, and an exception for routine maintenance or construction of docks and piers on Tomales Bay, and for maricultural activities conducted pursuant to a valid state lease or authority. Go to the next slide. So another thing is that discharge is prohibited in the sanctuary, other than from cruise ships. We have more restrictive discharge regulations for cruise ships. So you cannot discharge into a sanctuary. And of course, there are exceptions for this regulation as well. There's an exception for fish parts, or chumming as part of lawful fishing again. There's an exception for clean vessel deck wash, clean vessel engine cooling water, clean vessel generator cooling water, clean bilge water, and anchor wash. And then there's an exception for vessels less than 300 gross registered tons, or a vessel 300 gross registered tons or greater without sufficient holding tank capacity to hold sewage within the sanctuary. Let's see, the withholding tank, they can do clean effluent generated incidental to vessel use operation if they have a type 1 or 2 marine sanitation device that is approved in accordance with Section 312 of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, or the Clean Water Act. Next slide. So for cruise ships, we have stricter regulations, as I was mentioning. We prohibit discharging or depositing from within or into the sanctuary any material or other matter from a cruise ship except clean vessel engine cooling water, clean vessel generator cooling water, vessel engine or generator exhaust, and clean bilge water or anchor wash. So cruise ships are not allowed to discharge any sewage, even if they do have a sewage treatment facility on board. They're not allowed to discharge that in the sanctuary. So next slide. So discharges from outside the sanctuary regulation. So it is prohibited to discharge anything outside the sanctuary that then enters and harms the sanctuary. So for example, if there's an oil spill that happens, such as Casca Busan, which happened inside the San Francisco Bay, and that oil then enters and injures the sanctuary, that is a prohibition. And then the responsible party is held accountable for making the sanctuary whole again. So restoring resources that have been affected. Next slide. We also have vessel operation regulations. Our regulations prohibit deserting a vessel aground at anchor or adrift in the sanctuary, and or leaving harmful matter aboard a grounded or deserted vessel in the sanctuary. Next slide. We also prohibit the use of motorized personal watercraft, also known as jet skis, in certain areas of the sanctuary. In particular, it's the area south of Bodega Head to the southern sanctuary boundary. There is an exception for search and rescue training operations, as well as search and rescue in general. Next slide. We also have wildlife disturbance regulations. Inside the sanctuary, we have established special wildlife protection zones where there are significant populations of breeding and or resting, roosting seabirds and marine mammals, specifically pinnipeds, seals and sea lions along the shoreline, as well as we have a zone for protection of white sharks. You can see these zones on the map. Those are the gray boxes, and we overlay regulations onto these zones. And so one of the regulations we have is the prohibition of flying below 1,000 feet above the water over these zones, because it is assumed that it will disturb wildlife. And then for white sharks, we have an additional zone that extends 1 nautical mile further out from the wildlife protection zone, where it's prohibited to attract a white shark or approach within 50 meters of a white shark. Okay, if we can go to our next slide. Well, how do we manage the sanctuary? We manage it through engaging communities and getting feedback from our communities on what we need to be managing, how we should be managing it, what programs and regulations we should have. And we do this primarily through our Sanctuary Advisory Council, which is a public meeting. You are all invited to attend the meetings, provide public comment, provide input on topics we are discussing. And I'm going to go a little bit more into detail of the topics we're reviewing this year. And our advisory council is composed of stakeholders ranging from members of the fishing community to the research community, conservation community, other state and federal agencies, public at large members, youth members, education members that are there to help advise us on what the community thinks should be our priorities, where we should be concentrating our efforts, and how we should concentrate our efforts. And I'm going to go over a sampling of what types of programs now we do in the sanctuary. So you heard about regulations. Now we're going to jump into some of the programs and projects. You can go to the next slide. So one of those is we look to get compliance on our regulations through doing education, engagement, and partnerships. And one of those is through the Seabird Protection Network, in which we educate and work with boaters and pilots on how to not disturb wildlife, in particular seabirds. And we worked really closely with the state and through the state process on special wildlife closures for seabirds and pinnipeds during the MLPA process. And so we worked together on educating people how they can be stewards of our wildlife that we have here. Next slide. Another example of how we work with stakeholders is cooperation through education, engagement, and partnerships on voluntary measures. One of these is our voluntary speed reduction program. We work again with the state. We work with the state air districts on protecting blue whales and blue skies by requesting large vessels, 300 gross registered tons or larger, to slow down to 10 knots or less throughout the sanctuaries from May 1st to December 15th during the peak season of endangered and threatened blue, humpback, and fin whales. Because again, we are destination feeding ground. This is where they come and spend their time. And one of the leading causes of human related deaths to whales is ship strikes. So this is one of the efforts we work on to conserve biodiversity and conserve whale species. Next slide. So in addition to some of our regulatory programs and our volunteer programs, we also do habitat restoration. And this is one way in which we are working to conserve biodiversity. And here's a sample of the type of habitat restoration we do. We have eelgrass restoration projects in Tomales Bay. And you can see a picture of crop circles from anchors. And this is from anchors that swing, and it clears out all the eelgrass underneath. So we have a mooring program where there's moorings that are placed that are environmentally sensitive to allow boats to moor, and then it allows the eelgrass to come back. We're also working on kelp restoration, and we're doing this with the state as well in partnership. Many of you are probably aware of that. Through changing ocean conditions, we've seen a devastating loss of kelp and particularly in the sanctuary off the Sonoma coast. So we are bringing NOAA resources with state resources together to restore kelp by removing urchins and planting out spores, kelp spores. We're also working on wetlands restoration. This we're doing in partnership with the county, in particular Marin County and Greater Farallones Association. We're actually working with them on the kelp restoration as well. Have a very close partnership with this association on restoring wetlands in Bolinas Lagoon. We're also, through our advisory council, looking at how to restore native oysters in Tomales Bay. And this is a partnership, again, with Marin County. And we're looking at how to restore coral, deep sea coral in the sanctuary. And this we're doing right now in partnership with our sanctuary to the south, Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And then we've worked on restoring seabirds. And this is a partnership with other federal agencies, such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and with the state as well. How can we bring back seabird populations that have been impacted from events such as oil spills? Next slide. Okay, and as I mentioned, we do a lot of this through our Sanctuary Advisory Council process. And in addition to our programs and our projects and our restoration, we're also looking at how do we do this all in the face of climate change. This is an added stress that's been put on the sanctuary and something we have to consider when we're looking at restoration programs because they're not going to necessarily look the same as they had in the past. So we've been working to understand and plan for climate change through our advisory council. And with our through working groups and recommendations from the advisory council, we have put together climate impacts reports and climate profiles. How is climate change affecting the sanctuary now? How will it affect it in the future? And from that, looking at what are the most vulnerable species, habitats, and ecosystem services in the sanctuary. And then from that, how do we develop adaptation strategies to protect those or build resilience in those habitat, species, and ecosystem services so that they can continue to thrive and we can maintain these species and these habitats to the best of our abilities with a changing ocean. Next slide. So through this climate adaptation plan came out multiple different strategies, and we put them into a couple of buckets. And these are just a sampling of some of the buckets. One of them is living shorelines. How do we use natural systems to protect our shorelines from sea level rise, increased storminess, these extreme weather events we're seeing? So using natural solutions. Where do we need to focus restoration efforts to restore resilient habitats? How do we restore a resilient kelp forest? What are the blue carbon habitats and processes within the sanctuary? How do we make sure we're not unintentionally impacting them? And how can we maintain them and also make sure they are healthy? And then looking at sediment management. How do we manage the sediment in our sanctuary to make sure that we're continuing to have healthy habitats and healthy communities at the same time? So next slide. And just to dive a little bit deeper into climate change, we've been focusing lately on blue carbon, understanding what is blue carbon and what are those blue carbon processes in the sanctuaries. So we published a report on blue carbon and NPAs in general. You know, what type of blue carbon processes are in NPAs, and then looking specifically at Greater Farallones. What are those different habitats and processes? And one that we've identified that we hadn't been looking at is marine sediment. And so we'll be coming out this year with the third part in this series on marine sediment carbon. And what that looks like in the sanctuaries and what potentially impacts it and how we can engage in maintaining that carbon storage in our sediment. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Now I'm going to move into process. So you heard about our programs, some of our priorities, our regulations. and how we engage the public primarily through our advisory council. There is another way we engage the public, and that is through the National Environmental Policy Act process, or NEPA process. And we do this systematically every 10 years, approximately. That's when we look at doing a major deep dive into the sanctuary's management plan and our regulations. And this is coming up for the sanctuary in 2024. And that's why this webinar is very timely, because it's an opportunity for us to reach out to the community to say an opportunity is coming up for you to engage with the sanctuaries on what we can do to support the state's 30 by 30 goals, and what we can also do in the sanctuaries to make sure that we're doing what the community thinks are our highest priorities, where are we focusing our efforts, where do we need to maintain efforts, where do we need to do new efforts, to make sure we have a vital marine sanctuary that is supporting healthy communities. So just process, what does this look like? In 2024, we will initiate scoping. And this will happen through publishing a notice of intent within the Federal Register. We'll also put out public announcements, because probably a lot of you don't read the Federal Register every day. So we want to put it out there in publications that you're more likely to read as well. And this says, we would like comments on our management and our regulations. We are starting a process, and we'll put out a scoping document to give you more information. We'll then host public scoping meetings in which we will accept, we'll be accepting both written and verbal input, and we'll be accepting input through our Sanctuary Advisory Council. We will use this information to draft a revised management plan and draft any new or revised regulations. That would be a proposed rule. Those would then go out in a Federal Register, as well as we would publish them on our website. And again, get that out into the public for you to see it. It'll go through our advisory council. We'll be presenting during those public meetings. And we will be seeking comment on those draft documents. Once we get comments on those draft documents, we will look at our management plan and our proposed rule and revise as necessary based on public comments. We will also be reaching out to the state and the governor to see if there's any comments on activities in state waters. We'll revise those documents as necessary, and then publish a final environmental impact statement, or EA, environmental assessment, depending on the level of changes, in our final management plan, and issue a record of decision. So that's the process. Next slide. And so this is my last slide, because I really want to make sure we open it up to get feedback. So what are we doing now? What are we doing this year, and how can you engage this year as we're preparing for management plan review? The sanctuary is doing this through our advisory council and through topic briefing papers. And so a focus of our topic briefing papers are our habitats, our species, our maritime heritage, and we're assessing what are the status and trends. What does it look like? How healthy are they? What are the threats they're facing? What regulations do we currently have to address these threats? What programs do we have to understand the health, address the threats, and increase stewardship of those resources? What infrastructure needs do we have to support these programs? And what recommendations are there to maintain and or improve the health and resilience? And then we're going to combine this to a holistic document on those findings, on the regulations, programs, the infrastructure needs, those recommendations, and that will be the scoping document that goes out to the public. So we're doing this through a public process now. You can comment all year long during our advisory council meetings, and you can then, when it comes out as a scoping document and you can see it holistically, can comment again as we enter into scoping. With that, I'd love to hand it back over to you, Mike, so we can start hearing from the public.
Awesome. Thank you, Maria, for that great presentation. And let me pull our slides back up here. Just give me 1 second. We've got some questions here to frame up our discussion. Oops. Okay. And actually, you know, Elise, maybe do you want to just put these questions in the chat, and I'll read them out loud We're going to do 10 minutes for discussion here, so we've got 5 minutes at the end to wrap up. I'll read these out loud. This is just to kind of like provide some guardrails, but we're excited to hear from everybody. You know, anything you might want to say is welcome. So, what do you see as top threats to biodiversity within national marine sanctuaries? What protections might help address these threats? Importantly, how can OPC and national marine sanctuaries collaborate to reach 30 by 30 goals? And then how would you like to be involved in this effort? So please go ahead and raise your hand and I will call on folks. I think I saw a hand raised. Yeah, Mark Smith, I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute yourself. You have the floor.
Yeah, hi everybody. Jen, Michael, thanks for hosting this. Mark Smith, I work with a number of recreational fishing organizations and commercial fishing groups as well. You know, I'm very interested after this great presentation by Maria to hear the state's perspective on what the National Marine Sanctuaries are falling short on as it relates to being able to include them in the 30% target for, you know, 30% protections of our coastal waters. I mean, Maria, I was kind of blown away with the way that, you know, you're managing and the plans that you have in place and the programs and everything else like that. And I recognize that the state is saying there are still some additional things that they would like to see related to biodiversity protections. And I'd really like to understand that because, I mean, from a layman's perspective, I mean, again, I'm blown away with how you manage these and the biodiversity values they already have. Thank you.
So I'll jump in here. Thanks, Mark. Just to say that the state has not determined that they don't count. We are in the process of determining whether they do, right? And so there's a distinction there, and we're working really closely with Maria and the other superintendents to figure out kind of what that science-based criteria is to better understand that. So we know that sanctuaries are really special and important places and have a lot of incredible conservation benefit and activities going on. Also, we recognize that there may be threats that are facing resources within the sanctuary that were not contemplated 10 years ago when the management plan was last developed. I don't know if that number is right, Maria, that's my guess. And so this is a process that the sanctuary is already undertaking, and it's just a great opportunity to leverage the responsibilities the sanctuary has to continue adaptively managing the sanctuary and also leveraging our 30 by 30 effort.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate that. Because I've noted that America the Beautiful does reflect national marine sanctuaries as part of their target goal, and California is still working on making that decision. But appreciate the dialogue and thank you for inviting us and hosting this opportunity today.
Thanks, Mark. And I actually see a related question in the chat from Jim Hendricks. So Jim is asking, Maria said that the national marine sanctuaries are durably protected. Is OPC now in agreement with that statement?
We were always in agreement with that statement. Sanctuaries are durably protected. There are two components to the definition of conserved. And so we're not concerned about the durable piece, and we are just continuing to evaluate the ecosystem level benefit piece.
All right, I see Richard Sadowski, you've got a question. So go ahead and unmute yourself. You have the floor.
Thank you. One of the largest threats that, to answer the question is ocean acidification, and what we need more infrastructure on how we can get comparable data when we're doing some like, for instance, our university, there's a university, we're doing some ocean acidification analysis in our estuary, and it'd be nice to have comparable data throughout these sanctuaries and maybe expand that program with the NOAA PMEL projects, maybe putting a buoy out there and then maybe having that data available to researchers. So I don't know if it's a question, but maybe a comment on, the need to integrate that data a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I've got a question in the chat here that I think is probably best pose to you, Maria. So Marie is asking, do you find the voluntary speed reductions have reduced whale collisions and deaths, or should we be making speed reductions mandatory within sanctuaries?
And that is a question we are actively trying to answer, investigating. Our advisory council has, they recommended that we go to the full sanctuary and year round for a vessel speed reduction. So we've gone to a full sanctuary this year, and we've extended it slightly, our season than what it was before. And we're now having it be analyzed to see if we can reach our goal. Our goal is a very conservative goal. It is to reduce the risk of lethal ship strike to endangered and threatened blue, humpback, and fin whales by 50%. And when we did our analysis on our former voluntary zone, which was just the lanes, and it was for May 1st through November 15th, we were with a 60% cooperation from the shipping industry, we were reducing the risk to 23%. So we're almost halfway there to our goal, but only halfway. So we definitely have to take additional measures to get our goal of a 50% reduction in risk. What that is, we're experimenting right now with the full sanctuary, and we'll be doing an assessment on what reduction risk we'll get from that. And our advisory council has asked us to look at, is a mandatory vessel speed reduction needed in order to achieve 50% reduction.
Thanks, Maria. And another question, I think probably for you in the chat here, Caitlin is asking, are there regulations that are in place in other sanctuaries that are not in place yet in any of California's sanctuaries that you're exploring as part of the management plan update process?
That's a great question. We have not done that deep dive yet into looking at the regulations in other sanctuaries, but that's something we will be doing as we move further along in the process. If there are any regulations that others would like us to look into, please during this during our scoping period at our advisory councils, bring that to our attention, and we will definitely investigate.
So Maria, I actually might ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that last piece, because one of our questions was how folks could get involved. So you mentioned that there is the Sanctuary Advisory Council, which obviously those are nominated seats, but the meetings are open, that there's also going to be public comment on aspects of the management plan. So do you mind maybe providing a little bit more detail for folks who might want to get more involved in the process?
Sure, would love to. Love the interest. We have quarterly advisory council meetings. We do them on both north and south of the Golden Gate Bridge to try and reach both communities. And they're open to the public. They're posted on our website. Our website is farallones.noaa.org, and I can put that in the chat as well. We post when they are, so we have the schedule for the year already, and we have public comment during the meeting, so you can come and give public comment. You also, if and we do virtual, it's a hybrid meeting, virtual in person, to try and get have as much participation as possible. And thanks, Elise, for putting that link in the chat. So if you can't come, either participate virtually or in person, we also have our Sanctuary Advisory Council members, and they represent a constituency. They're not supposed to be representing themselves as an individual, but as their constituency. And so we have both public at large members for all the counties that border the sanctuary. And then we have different user groups or stakeholders. So I would recommend looking at our website for who your members that are supposed to be representing you are, and reaching out to them. There's contact information available, and or coming to a meeting, participating virtually or in person. In addition, when we do start management plan review, we will have a public comment period where you can submit it in writing. We will have public scoping meetings in which we'll do an overview presentation and then breakout groups for people from the public to participate in, to provide comment. And then when we have the draft plan out, we'll have a public hearing where people can come and provide public comment during that public hearing.
Awesome. Thank you, Maria. So this is a question from Anupa in the chat, again for you, Maria. And it looks like Abby has also put some information in the chat about public engagement. So that's great. Thank you, Abby. So Anupa asks, many sanctuary condition reports indicate that commercial fishing may be having negative impacts on sanctuary health. And she's wondering how the sanctuary might be looking to address that through the process that you outlined, Maria.
So for Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, we are completing a condition report. And our condition reports look at what is the status and trends of key resources within the sanctuary. And fish are our key resource in the sanctuary. And we will be we're actually looking at it right now. It's an expert review. We're looking at what are the status and trends of key fish species, representative fish species in the sanctuary. That information has, we're still in the process of developing our condition report, and that will be available to the public. Next June is our target date to have the condition report out, in which will identify what is the status and trends and health of those species so that we can then address areas and where we see there are certain, where there are threats and what those threats might be.
Great. Thank you. And I think we're going to go straight up till the top of the hour on questions, because this is great. So I definitely encourage folks to turn cameras on and ask questions to Jen or Maria directly. Anyone else want to raise a hand and jump in the discussion here?
I'll jump in just to say that we've really been kind of showcasing and highlighting the effort that Maria's doing with Greater Farallones, but we are really hoping that kind of the process through this partnership will help inform any potential strategies for the other sanctuaries that overlap with state water. So we have great relationships and partnerships with leadership and staff at those other sanctuaries. So just folding that in for everyone's awareness as well.
And on that note, we've got a question from Aubrey in the chat about the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. So she's wondering how this new proposed sanctuary down in Southern California might fit into conversations around 30 by 30.
It's an excellent question. And again, I think it is hopefully going to be informed by the work that we're starting to do now around Greater Farallones. We can get some additional structure and understanding in this effort that I hope it will inform the other sanctuaries.
And I think we've got time for one more question. I see a question in the chat from Caitlin to Maria. Can you talk a little bit more about the sanctuary's coral restoration effort?
Yes, so we just put out a draft restoration plan for coral that was impacted by a dry dock that sunk. It sunk actually in the very northern part of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, part that the Greater Farallones manages. And so we're looking at sites within Greater Farallones and Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary to restore like habitat, since removing the dry dock is not an option. As part of this process, we're also looking at deep sea coral in general in the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary as part of our management plan review. And are there deep sea coral habitats that are damaged that we need to focus our efforts on to restore in general? So that's a process we are planning to embark on, like looking at where these areas are starting next month.
Great. Thank you. I understand folks might have to hop. I see one more question from Wayne in the chat here. What is it's kind of related to Mark's question. What is the timing to review National Marine Sanctuaries to get them included potentially in the 30 by 30 numbers, and who makes the qualification decision? So Jen, that's for you.
Yes, Wayne, great tee up for, I think, next steps. So maybe we can, Elise, if you don't mind throwing up the next step slide. I think those of you who have been on this journey with us from the previous webinars understand that we hosted, along with our partners, Ocean Science Trust, a workshop to understand, to start to build out what the comprehensive inventory of our existing spatial management measures looks like in California. We are hoping to share that for public review in the coming weeks. And really what we want feedback on is, did we capture everything? What did we miss? And then the subsequent step to that is really going to be establishing some type of scientific expert panel to really dig into, okay, what do each of those areas, what is the purpose of each area? Are they providing ecosystem level benefits? And then we can start making the determination. So Wayne, short answer to your question is ultimately the Ocean Protection Council will be making those decisions, but they will be science-based and informed by all of the feedback that we're receiving from everyone who's been participating, who wants to participate in this process. So more on that soon. I don't have a more detailed timeline for you, but we're working as quickly as possible to keep the pieces moving forward. And with that, I think I will close us and just say thank you to everyone for your continued interest. If you're interested in sending more questions or feedback, we have a direct 30 by 30 email address showing here. And we look forward to continue to working with you, all of you, on this. And Maria, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. It was really great.
Well, thank you. My pleasure. Looking forward to working with you on this.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.